On a December night in 1916, a small group of Russian aristocrats decided the only way to save their country was to kill one man. They poisoned his food. When that didn't work, they shot him. When he still wouldn't stay down, they beat him and threw him into a frozen river. That's the story everyone knows. Grigory Rasputin, the man who couldn't be killed. But the actual autopsy report, the real one, filed by the doctor who examined the body in 1916, doesn't support most of it. No poison was confirmed. No water was found where it needed to be for him to have drowned. And one specific wound, fired at point-blank range, was almost certainly fatal before he ever touched the water. This is the case file on the most famous murder legend in Russian history, reopened. Welcome back to the Bone Verdict. We don't repeat the legend just because it's the version everyone's heard 100 times. We go to whatever physical record survives, and in this case, that's an actual autopsy report from December 1916, rediscovered and re-examined by historians and forensic specialists decades later. Stay through this one, because the real account of what happened to Rasputin's body is, in some ways, stranger than the myth. First, the context, because none of this happened in a vacuum. By late 1916, Rasputin was a peasant mystic who had become one of the most influential and most hated figures at the Russian imperial court. He'd arrived in St. Petersburg years earlier as an unremarkable wandering holy man, but he gained something no one else around the imperial family had. He seemed able to ease the suffering of Tsarina Alexandra's hemophiliac son, the heir to the throne. To the royal family, that made him indispensable, almost sacred. To much of the aristocracy and the political establishment, it made him a corrupting outsider with terrifying, unchecked access to the people actually running the country during a war Russia was losing badly. By 1916, rumors about Rasputin's influence had become impossible to separate from reality. Stories of him interfering in military appointments, in church politics, even in decisions about ministers, true or not, were everywhere. The war was going badly. Bread lines were getting longer, and for a significant slice of the nobility, Rasputin became the explanation for all of it, the single visible cause they could point to and imagine removing. A small circle decided he had to be removed. The plot was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, along with the right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich and a member of the imperial family himself, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Yusupov's close friend and a cousin of the Tsar. Almost everything we think we know about that night comes from one source, Purishkevich's own memoir, published years later. Keep that in mind, because a participant's account of his own crime is not the same thing as evidence. According to that account, Rasputin was lured to Yusupov's palace late on the night of December 29th into the 30th and served cakes and wine laced with cyanide. The story goes that he ate and drank for hours and showed no effect at all, which the conspirators found almost supernatural at the time. Eventually, panicked that the poison wasn't working, Yusupov reportedly shot him once in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. The group believed him dead and left the room. Then, in the legend's most famous beat, Rasputin allegedly got back up, attacked Yusupov, and tried to escape into the courtyard, where Purishkevich shot him again, twice more. The body was then beaten, wrapped, and driven to the Neva River, where it was pushed through a hole in the ice. That's the legend. Now here's what the actual physical evidence says. An autopsy was performed shortly after the body was recovered, conducted by Professor Dmitry Kosaratov, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in Russia at the time. His report survived, and it has been re-examined multiple times since, most notably in a detailed 1993 review of the surviving documentation and photographs by a forensic medical specialist, alongside later work by historians who returned to the original sources rather than relying on Purishkevich's published account. The first problem with the legend: there is no reliable evidence that cyanide was actually in Rasputin's system. No poison was confirmed in the examination, and several historians have pointed out a more basic issue. Accounts of the amount supposedly used would have killed several men almost immediately, not left someone seemingly unaffected for hours. The second problem is bigger, and it's the one that really breaks the story. The drowning detail. Rasputin thrown into the river still alive, struggling, dying by water rather than by the wounds already on his body, depends on one specific kind of evidence: water in the lungs. That's not what the autopsy describes. Multiple historians who've reviewed Kosaratov's findings have noted the report does not support drowning as the cause of death. If he had gone into that water alive and fighting to breathe, the physical signature of that struggle should have been there. By most readings of the surviving record, it wasn't. Which means the most cinematic part of the entire legend, the unkillable man, still alive, drowning under the ice, is the part the body argues against the hardest. So if he wasn't poisoned in any way that mattered, and he didn't drown, what does the report actually point to? 3 gunshot wounds, consistent with the account of multiple shooters. But of those 3, one stands out in the documentation. A wound to the forehead, fired at extremely close range, close enough that the 1993 forensic review pointed to it specifically as a point-blank shot, the kind delivered to make absolutely certain. That's the wound that lines up with what a forensic examiner would expect to be immediately fatal. Not the poisoning that may never have happened the way it was described, not a struggle in icy water. One close-range shot to the head, while the other wounds and the dramatic struggle described in the memoir may have been layered onto the story afterward, whether through trauma, self-mythologizing, or simply the natural drift of a story being told and retold by the one man with every reason to make his own role sound more dramatic. This is where the case gets genuinely interesting, because it's not really a story about Rasputin anymore. It's a story about how a legend gets built on top of a body. Purishkevich wrote his account after the fact, as a justification. He and his co-conspirators saw themselves as saviors of Russia, men who'd had to overcome something almost demonic to do what needed to be done. A version where Rasputin shrugs off poison and survives multiple gunshots serves that narrative far better than a version where 3 armed men shot an unarmed man once, fatally, at point-blank range. The body doesn't care about anyone's narrative. It just records what happened to it. It's worth following what happened to the 3 men at the center of this, because their fates afterward say almost as much as the autopsy does. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, as a member of the imperial family, couldn't simply be tried in open court. The political risk of a public trial implicating the Tsar's own cousin was too high. He was exiled to a military unit in Persia, which, as it turned out, may have saved his life. It removed him from Russia before the revolution swept through the following year. Yusupov was banished to one of his country estates. Purishkevich faced no real punishment at all and continued his political career for a short time longer before dying of typhus during the civil war that followed the revolution. None of them faced anything resembling justice for an actual murder. The Tsarina wanted them executed. The Tsar, weighing the politics of the moment, settled for exile instead. Within a little over a year, the monarchy both men had killed to protect collapsed anyway, and most of the imperial family Rasputin had served were dead. Here's why that one forensic detail matters well beyond just this one assassination. Go look across history, court records, battlefield investigations, even modern studies of group violence, and this exact pattern shows up again and again. Groups that commit to violence together almost never leave physical evidence that matches the unity of the story they tell about themselves afterward. Some hesitate. Some strike only once the outcome is already decided. Some barely participate at all, land one token wound, and let the size of the group carry their guilt for them. Rasputin's body, examined within hours by a physician history barely remembers, is one of the most striking examples we have of a different version of that same gap. Not too many wounds claiming false credit, but a single account turning one decisive act into a far more dramatic, drawn-out struggle than the physical evidence supports. 60 senators raised a blade against Caesar in the name of liberty, and the body said only one strike actually mattered. 3 men conspired against Rasputin in the name of saving Russia, and the body says the killing was over far sooner and far less dramatically than the man who wrote the story wanted anyone to believe. It's worth pausing on why the dramatic version won out so completely for over a century, because that's its own kind of evidence. Purishkevich's account wasn't just self-serving. It arrived at exactly the moment Russia needed Rasputin to be something larger than a man who could be killed with a single bullet. An almost supernatural villain, resistant to poison and gunfire, made the men who finally brought him down look less like murderers and more like reluctant heroes facing something monstrous. That story got repeated in Soviet propaganda, in Western press coverage at the time, and eventually in nearly every film and book made about him since. Each retelling adding its own dramatic flourishes on top of an account that was already exaggerated to begin with. By the time the original autopsy documentation was properly re-examined, the legend had a 100-year head start. None of this makes Rasputin's death less brutal. 3 men still conspired to kill him, and did. What it changes is which parts of the story are documented fact, and which parts are a self-serving account that's been repeated so many times it calcified into history. The forensic record says he was very likely dead, or close to it, from a single shot to the head, not poisoned into immunity, not drowned alive under the ice. We don't have certainty on every detail. The original report itself has gaps, and some of the surviving documentation has been questioned and re-examined by different historians over the decades, with disagreements that haven't fully settled. But the core claims of the popular legend, the poison that didn't work, the drowning, are the parts with the weakest support in the actual physical evidence, while the parts that get the least attention in retellings, the close-range gunshot, are the parts the body backs up most clearly. That's the gap this channel exists to look at. Not which version of the story is more entertaining, which version the evidence actually supports. History gave Rasputin one legend. The mystic who survived poison and bullets, finally killed by drowning under the ice. The body, examined within hours by a respected forensic pathologist, suggests something far less supernatural, and far more familiar to anyone who's looked closely at how stories about violence get told by the people who committed it. That's the gap this channel lives in. Not the story everyone already knows. What the evidence, looked at honestly, actually shows. So tell me, does it change how you see this story? Knowing the most famous detail, the unkillable man drowning under the ice, may be the least supported part of the entire legend. Leave your verdict in the comments. I read every single one. Case closed. I'll see you in the next file.